Gavin had it all. Success, money, recognition. But when he walked into that coffee shop for a blind date, he never expected to hear the words that would change everything. "You don't remember me, do you?" Stella was standing right in front of him, carrying memories of a past he had forgotten, but that she could never erase. And that night, he would discover that some stories don't end in high school. They just wait for the right moment to begin again. Gavin Reynolds never believed in destiny. To him, life was a series of well-negotiated contracts, met deadlines, and calculated strategies. At 34, he was a partner at one of the city's most respected law firms, a man who transformed chaos into order, who sold certainty in a world of doubt. But that Friday afternoon, as he adjusted his Italian silk tie in the office bathroom mirror, he couldn't ignore the emptiness pulsing in his chest like a poorly healed wound. "It'll be quick," he muttered to himself, running gel through his dark hair, now slightly graying at the temples. 1 hour max. Polite, cordial, and then you make up some excuse. His younger sister, Sophie, had been insisting for weeks. "You need to get out of that bubble, Gavin. When was the last time you talked to someone who wasn't a client or a judge?" He had resisted, of course. Blind dates were for desperate people, for those who still believed in fairy tales. But Sophie had that irritating way of not giving up, and he, tired of hearing her lectures, finally gave in. The Rosewood Cafe sat in the heart of the historic district, far from the glass and steel skyscrapers where Gavin spent his days. The streets were narrow, paved with ancient stones that echoed under his leather shoes as he walked. The aroma of freshly baked bread escaped from a nearby bakery, mixing with the sweet scent of flowers overflowing from window boxes. It was a different world, slower, more human, a world he had forgotten existed. When he pushed the cafe door open, a delicate bell announced his arrival. The place was cozy, almost intimate. Exposed brick walls, wooden tables worn by time, yellowish lights hanging from the ceiling like small moons. There was the soft murmur of conversations, the clink of cups against saucers, the hiss of the espresso machine. Gavin took a deep breath, roasted coffee, cinnamon, something sweet he couldn't quite identify. His shoulders, tense as violin strings, began to relax imperceptibly. He chose a table near the window from where he could see the street. He adjusted his suit, a charcoal gray Armani that cost more than many people earned in a month, and checked his watch. 5 minutes to 6. She was late. Or maybe she'd changed her mind. Part of him secretly hoped for that. And then the door opened again. Gavin looked up instinctively, and the world around him seemed to turn down its volume, as if someone had twisted an invisible knob. The golden afternoon light filtered through the door, creating an aura around the female silhouette entering. When she stepped forward out of the backlight, Gavin felt something strange happen in his chest, as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. She was different, not in the conventional sense of beauty he was used to seeing. She didn't have that artificial shine, that retouched perfection of the women who frequented the same social circles as him. There was something genuine about her, something that hit him like an unexpected punch. Chestnut hair fell in natural waves over her shoulders, capturing the light in a way that made Gavin think of spilled honey. She wore a simple moss-green dress that danced lightly around her legs as she walked. But it was her eyes that held him, deep brown, almost golden when the light caught them at the right angle. Eyes that seemed to hold stories, secrets, a depth that completely disarmed him. She spotted him, and a restrained smile curved her lips. Not exactly joy, but something more complex. There was knowledge in that smile, a kind of recognition that Gavin couldn't understand. He stood up automatically, nearly knocking over his chair in the process. "Stella," she said. "Gavin." She said his name as if tasting something she had known for a long time. There was texture in that word, layers he couldn't decipher. When she extended her hand, he took it. Her skin was warm, soft, but there was firmness in that handshake. It wasn't the delicate, purposeless touch he was accustomed to. It was a grip that said, "I am here, really." A shiver ran up his spine, something electric that made him hold her hand for a second longer than socially appropriate. She sat down, and Gavin did the same, feeling strangely exposed under that penetrating gaze. There was something about her that made him uneasy, as if she could see through the expensive suit, the luxury watch, the defenses carefully built over the years. "Your sister talks a lot about you," Stella began. hands intertwined on the table. He noticed she wore no rings, just a thin silver bracelet on her left wrist. "Sophie has the inconvenient habit of talking too much," he replied, trying to inject lightness into his voice, but it came out more tense than he intended. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged dense, like the air before a storm. Gavin opened his mouth to say something, anything to fill that void, but Stella spoke first. "You don't remember me, do you?" The words fell between them like stones thrown into a calm lake, creating ripples that expanded, touching everything. Gavin blinked, his racing mind trying to process the question. He studied her face more carefully, the curve of her nose, the shape of her lips, the delicate line of her jaw. There was something familiar, perhaps, something that pulled at a distant memory, but nothing concrete. "I'm sorry, I don't—" He stopped, feeling his throat tighten. There was something in her eyes now, not exactly hurt, but an old sadness like a scar that never completely disappears. Stella tilted her head slightly, and that restrained smile returned, but this time there was a hint of melancholy in it. "Don't worry. I didn't expect you to remember. Have we met before?" Gavin's voice came out lower than he intended, almost a whisper. "Yes, a long time ago." She picked up the menu, but her eyes didn't leave his face. "But I was different. Invisible, actually." Gavin felt his heart speed up. There was a story there, he could feel it, something big, something important that he had missed. And for the first time in years he wasn't thinking about deadlines, contracts, strategies. He was just there, completely present, caught in those brown eyes that seemed to contain entire universes. "Tell me," he said. And it wasn't a polite request. It was a necessity. Stella picked up the coffee cup the waitress had brought and wrapped her hands around it, as if seeking warmth on an afternoon that wasn't cold. Gavin observed the gesture delicate, contained, but there was tension in her shoulders that betrayed a carefully hidden vulnerability. She gently blew across the dark liquid surface, creating small ripples, and for a moment seemed lost in a distant place, a time only she could see. "Lincoln High School," she finally said, raising her eyes to meet his. "Class of 2009. Gavin felt something contract in his chest. Lincoln High. He knew that name, of course. He had spent 4 years there, years he preferred not to revisit too frequently, not because they were bad, but because they represented a version of himself that no longer existed. The popular boy, the debate team captain, the one who always had a joke ready and friends around. That seemed like another life, another person. We went to school together." He frowned, desperately trying to pull up some memory, some fragment of recognition. But there were so many faces from that time, so many people who walked those hallways. "We attended the same school," Stella gently corrected, and there was an important distinction in that choice of words. "But together would be too generous. You were, well, you were at the top. I was—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. Somewhere else entirely. She placed the cup back on the saucer and took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into deep waters. "I was Stella Morgan. Hair always disheveled because I didn't have time to fix it in the morning. Thrift store clothes that never quite fit right. The girl who arrived late because she took 2 buses to get to school." The image began to form in Gavin's mind, hazy at first, like a photograph slowly developing. "Was there such a girl? I sat in the back of the literature classroom," she continued, her voice now having a distant quality, as if narrating someone else's life. "Always with a book, wore a gray hoodie that was too worn out even in the heat because it hid the stains on the clothes underneath. You sat in front, always surrounded by friends. Tyler Bennett to your left, making everyone laugh. Melissa Crawford to your right, playing with her hair and looking at you like you were the only person in the room." The names hit Gavin like arrows. Tyler, Melissa. People he hadn't thought about in years. And with those names came fragments, the smell of Melissa's too sweet perfume, Tyler's booming laugh, afternoons at the diner after school, plans for weekend parties at houses with absent parents. "I don't," Gavin began, but didn't know how to finish the sentence. "Sorry" would sound empty. "I wasn't paying attention" would be cruel. "I didn't know" would be true, but no less painful. Stella raised her hand, a gentle gesture that interrupted him. "I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty, Gavin. I really am not. I was invisible not just to you, but to almost everyone. And part of that was my choice. I had to work after school, had to take care of my sick mother. There was no room in my life to be seen. She took another sip of coffee, and Gavin saw her throat move as she swallowed. There was an elegance about her now, a grace that came from survival, from having fought and won invisible battles. But he could imagine the girl she described, shoulders curved under the weight of responsibilities no teenager should carry, eyes downcast to avoid attention, a life lived in the shadows. But there were times, her voice grew softer, almost a whisper, there were times when you looked in my direction, when the teacher asked something and nobody answered, I would raise my hand. You would turn around curious as if thinking, who is this girl? And for a second, just a second, I existed. Gavin felt a knot forming in his throat. There was something deeply intimate about that confession, something that made him feel both exposed and humbled at the same time. And then there was that day, Stella continued, her eyes now focused on some point beyond the window, lost in the past. It was October of senior year. It was raining, one of those autumn downpours that soak you to the bone. I was in the hallway carrying a stack of books from the library because I worked as an assistant there during lunch. My bag had torn that morning, so I was carrying everything in my arms. She paused, and a sad smile touched her lips. Tyler Bennett was running down the hallway with those friends of his, doing some kind of stupid prank. He bumped into me. Books flew everywhere, papers scattered, and I fell to my knees on the wet floor someone had just cleaned. Gavin closed his eyes. He could see the scene now, not clearly, but its essence. He remembered the time when Tyler thought it was funny to run through the hallways, how their group was sometimes too loud, too unaware. Everyone laughed, Stella said, and there was no accusation in her voice, just the statement of a fact. Including you, for a moment. You laughed too. But then she stopped. And when she spoke again, there was something different in her tone, something warm, almost reverent. Then you stopped. You looked at me, really looked, and I saw something change in your face. You bent down and started picking up the books with me. You said something to Tyler, I didn't hear what, but he stopped laughing. And you helped me up. Gavin's hands were clenched into fists on the table, knuckles white from squeezing so hard. Fragments of memory began to emerge, a girl on the floor, scattered books, the embarrassment of having laughed at something that wasn't funny. You handed me the books, Stella continued, her eyes now fixed on his with an intensity that held him in place, and said, sorry about them. Sometimes we forget that other people have hard days too. They were just words, Gavin. You probably don't even remember saying them. But to me, her voice faltered slightly. To me, it was the first time anyone saw me as a human being in that school. The silence that fell between them was heavy, loaded with emotional weight. Gavin could hear the low buzz of conversation around them, the clinking of dishes in the kitchen, but everything seemed distant, muffled. In that moment, there were only the two of them and the past unfolding between them like a forgotten map. Stella, he began, but didn't know how to continue. How do you apologize for not seeing someone? For being young and selfish and blind to the worlds that existed beyond your small circle? You don't need to say anything, she gently interrupted. I'm not telling you this to make you pay for something. I'm telling you because you asked who I am. And this is part of who I was. She leaned slightly forward, and Gavin could smell her subtle perfume, something floral mixed with vanilla, delicate but persistent. But there's more, she said, and there was something different in her eyes now, a mixture of vulnerability and courage. There's one night you really might not remember. A night that changed everything for me. The light in the cafe was beginning to change, becoming softer, more golden as the sun descended on the horizon. Shadows danced on the exposed brick walls, and the movement of people on the street outside was slowing down, as if the entire city was shifting into a different rhythm. Gavin hadn't touched his coffee. He was completely absorbed in Stella, in every word that left her lips, in every micro-expression that crossed her face. It was at Jake Harrison's graduation party, Stella began, and her voice had an almost dreamlike quality now, as if she was reliving every detail with cinematic clarity. His house on that huge hill with the garden that seemed to go on forever. Half the school was there. The other half hadn't been invited. Gavin remembered that party. How could he forget? It had been epic, the kind of event that defined senior year. Lights hanging from trees, loud music, people jumping into the pool fully clothed at 3 in the morning. He had drunk too much. Whiskey that Tyler had stolen from his own father's bar, mixed with Coca-Cola in red plastic cups. "I wasn't at the party," Stella said, and an ironic smile touched her lips. "Of course not. I was coming back from work. I cleaned offices downtown from 8 at night until midnight, 3 times a week. Wore that horrible blue uniform with my name embroidered on the pocket, hair tied in a tight bun that gave me headaches." She paused to breathe, her fingers playing with the handle of her cup. Gavin noticed how elegant her hands were, long fingers, short, clean nails, no polish, hands that worked, that created, that sustained. "It was almost 1 in the morning when I passed by the Harrisons' house," she continued, her eyes now lost in memory. "I could hear the music from down below, saw the lights through the trees. Part of me just wanted to keep going, catch my bus, and go home. But there was something about that night, a curiosity, perhaps, or loneliness. I don't know." She looked at Gavin, and there was a raw vulnerability in her eyes that made him hold his breath. "I climbed a few steps of the entrance just to see. I wasn't going to go in, of course. I knew my place. But I just wanted to take a peek at the world I would never be part of." Gavin felt something tighten in his chest, a mixture of shame and sadness for that girl who had been left outside, looking in at a life she believed she could never have. "And that's when I saw you," Stella said, and her voice became softer, more intimate. "You were sitting on the front steps, away from the party, alone. Your tie was loose, your dress shirt wrinkled, your hair all messed up. You had a beer bottle in your hand, but you weren't drinking, just holding it, staring into nothing." The memory began to come back to Gavin, hazy at first, but taking shape. He remembered that night, that specific moment. He had fought with Melissa, or perhaps she had fought with him. Something about attention, about him never really being present even when he was there. Her words had hit him in an unexpected way because they were true. He was always planning the next step, the next achievement, never just existing. "I should have left," Stella continued, her eyes now fixed on his with an intensity that held him. "But you looked so lost. And I knew that look. It was the same one I saw in the mirror every morning." She took a deep breath, as if preparing for the hardest part. "You saw me. And for the first time, Gavin, you really saw me. You didn't look through me like in the school hallways. Your eyes found me, and you smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was sad, somewhat broken, but it was real." Gavin could see it now, the girl in the cleaning uniform standing in the dimness of the entrance, outside the reach of the party lights. He remembered thinking she looked tired, too young and too old at the same time. "You said, 'Are you escaping the party too?'" Stella quoted, and a small smile touched her lips with the memory. "And I didn't know what to say because I wasn't escaping anything. I had never been invited. But you patted the spot beside you on the steps as if it was the most natural thing in the world. And I sat down." She closed her eyes for a moment, reliving it. "We sat there in silence for a while. You asked my name. I told you. You said it was beautiful, that it suited me. No one had ever said that before." Gavin felt his throat tighten. He remembered now the way she had sat stiffly beside him, maintaining a respectful distance, as if afraid of taking up too much space. There had been something about her that intrigued him, a quietness that contrasted with the chaos of the party behind them. "You asked where I was coming from," Stella continued, opening her eyes. "I said I was returning from work. You were surprised, asked where I worked. When I said I cleaned offices, you didn't laugh, didn't look at me differently. You just nodded, as if you understood." She leaned a little closer, and Gavin could see the small golden flecks in her brown eyes like hidden stars. "And then you did something I never forgot. You took out your wallet and pulled out some bills, $50, I think. You held them out to me and said, 'Take a taxi. It's late. It's not safe for you to take the bus at this hour.'" The memory was completely clear now for Gavin, the way she had pulled back, shaking her head, eyes wide with something between pride and hurt. She had thought it was pity, charity of the worst kind. "I said no," Stella continued, her voice thick with emotion. "Said I didn't need charity. And you—" She paused, her eyes shining. "You took my hand. It was the first time someone from that school had really touched me with gentleness. And you said something that I've kept in my heart all these years." She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, it was slowly, savoring each word as if they were sacred. "You said, 'It's not charity, Stella. It's just one human being looking out for another.' We should do that more. I should do that more." Tears began to form in the corners of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "You put the money in my hand, closed my fingers around it, and said, 'Please let me do at least this one thing right today.' There was something in your voice, Gavin, something broken but trying to fix itself." Gavin felt his own vision blur. He now remembered the guilt he had felt that night, all the times he had turned his face away from small injustices, how empty he had felt despite having everything. And that girl with her uniform and her tiredness and her fierce dignity had represented something he couldn't name at the time. "I took the taxi," Stella said softly, "and on the way home, I cried. Not from sadness, but because someone had seen me. Someone had cared, even if just for 5 minutes. And I promised myself that one day, if our paths ever crossed again, I would thank you." She reached her hand across the table, and Gavin took it instinctively. Her skin was warm, soft, but there was strength in that grip. "So thank you, Gavin, for that night. For that moment of humanity when I needed it most. For seeing me when I was invisible." Gavin squeezed her hand, unable to speak. There was a hurricane of emotions inside him: shame for the selfish boy he had been, admiration for the strong woman she had become, and something else, something new and frightening, pulsing in his chest. "Does that boy still exist?" Stella asked softly, her eyes searching his. "The one who cared? The one who saw people?" And Gavin, looking into those deep brown eyes at this extraordinary woman who had carried his small kindnesses like treasures all these years, realized he was about to discover the answer. The silence that settled between them wasn't empty. It was dense, loaded with everything that had been said and everything still hanging in the air, unspoken. Gavin was still holding Stella's hand across the table, their fingers intertwined in a way that seemed both intimate and natural, as if their hands had known each other for years. He could feel her pulse beating beneath her skin, quick, alive, real. "I don't know if that boy still exists," Gavin finally said, his voice lower than normal. There was a brutal honesty in those words that surprised him. "I've spent so much time transforming into something else, someone relentless, focused, who leaves no room for weakness. I don't know what's left of him." Stella didn't withdraw her hand. Instead, she gently ran her thumb over his knuckles, a gesture so small, but one that sent waves of warmth up Gavin's arm. "Maybe he's just hiding," she said softly, "waiting for someone worth coming out for." Their eyes met, and Gavin felt something shift inside him, like tectonic plates rearranging after years of stillness. There was something in Stella's eyes, a mixture of vulnerability and strength, of past and present, that completely disarmed him. All the strategies he used in boardrooms, all the masks he had perfected over the years, were useless here. He found himself noticing details that would normally go unnoticed. The way she slightly bit her lower lip when thinking, leaving a temporary mark that he had an inexplicable desire to touch. The delicate curve of her neck exposed when she tilted her head a certain way. How her eyes narrowed slightly when she genuinely smiled, creating small wrinkles at the corners that made her even more beautiful. "What did you do after school?" Gavin asked, realizing he wanted to know everything, every detail, every step she had taken to become this woman sitting across from him. Stella gently released his hand, but the warmth of her touch remained like an invisible mark. She picked up her coffee cup, already cold, but kept it between her hands as if she needed something to hold. "I got a full scholarship to the state university," she said, and there was pride in her voice. "I studied education. I wanted to be a teacher, help children like me, those who come from difficult places, those nobody sees." "And did you?" Gavin asked, leaning forward, genuinely interested. "I teach literature at a public high school on the east side of the city," she answered, and her eyes lit up in a way that made Gavin's heart tighten. "It's not glamorous. Resources are limited, salaries are low, and some days are so hard that I drive home crying. But when a student who's never read a whole book tells me they finally understand why stories matter," she paused, a soft smile touching her lips. "In those moments, I know I'm exactly where I should be." Gavin felt something strange happen inside him, a mixture of admiration and envy. When was the last time he had felt such passion for his work? When had he woken up eager to start the day instead of dragging himself through the routine, driven only by discipline and obligation? "And you?" Stella asked, leaning slightly forward. The movement caused the neckline of her dress to shift slightly, revealing the delicate curve of her collarbone. Gavin forced himself to keep his eyes on her face, but it was hard not to notice the way the light touched her skin. "Sophie told me you're a successful lawyer partner at a big firm." "Yes," Gavin said, and the word came out loaded with something that seemed very much like disappointment. "Corporate law mergers, acquisitions, litigation worth millions. It's lucrative, but it's not what makes you happy," Stella observed. And it wasn't a question. Gavin laughed a low sound without humor. "No, it's not." He ran his hand through his hair, messing it up in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "I wake up at 5 in the morning, go to the gym, get to the office by 7, work until 8 or 9 at night, go home, eat something I ordered through an app, answer a few more emails, and sleep. The next day, I start all over again." "That's not living, Gavin," Stella said softly. "It's just existing." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach because they were true. He had built a life that looked impressive on paper, the expensive apartment, the imported car, the robust bank account, but it was empty. It was a beautiful shell with nothing inside. "I know," he admitted, and there was raw pain in those two words. "But I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to be different." Stella reached out again, and this time lightly touched his arm, her fingers resting on the fabric of his suit between his elbow and wrist. It was a casual, comforting touch, but Gavin felt it like electricity. "Maybe you just need a reason," she said. Their eyes met again, and the air between them changed, became thicker, more charged. Gavin was aware of every breath, of every beat of his heart, of the heat emanating from the small point where her fingers touched his arm. He wanted to move closer, wanted to close the distance between them. But there was something stronger than physical desire. There was a need to understand, to know, to be known. "Are you with someone?" he asked suddenly, and the question came out more direct than he intended. "A boyfriend? Husband?" Stella shook her head, a small, sad smile on her lips. "I've had relationships. Some lasted months, one lasted almost 2 years, but there was always something missing. I always felt like I was settling, accepting less than I deserved because it was easier than being alone. And now I'd rather be alone than be with someone who doesn't really see me," she answered. And there was a firmness in her voice that Gavin admired. "I spent too much time being invisible. I won't accept that in my personal life too." Gavin swallowed hard. He wanted to say that he saw her, that he couldn't stop seeing her since she had walked into the cafe, but the words seemed insufficient. Instead, he did something that surprised him, something instinctive, driven by an impulse he didn't know he had. He reached out and gently brushed away a strand of hair that had fallen over her face, carefully tucking it behind her ear. His fingers lightly grazed her skin, the temple, the cheek, the earlobe, and he felt Stella catch her breath. She didn't pull away. Her eyes widened slightly, her lips parted in small surprise, but she remained exactly where she was, letting him touch her. The moment stretched, suspended in time, and Gavin could see the small golden flecks in her eyes more clearly, like miniature galaxies. "Sorry," he whispered. But it didn't sound like an apology. It sounded like something else, a confession, perhaps, or a promise. "Don't apologize," Stella replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not when it's like this." The waitress appeared beside the table, breaking the moment. "Would you like to order something to eat?" she asked, smiling with that professional politeness that didn't notice or pretended not to notice the tension in the air. Gavin looked at Stella, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Yes," she said to the waitress, but her eyes never left Gavin's. "We'll stay a bit longer." And in those simple words, Gavin heard something deeper. "I'm not ready to leave." Not yet. Neither was he. The food arrived: French toast for Stella, a sandwich that Gavin barely touched, but neither of them paid much attention to what was on their plates. They had plunged into a different kind of hunger, a need to know and be known that transcended any physical appetite. The conversation flowed between them like a river, finding its natural path, winding and deep, touching places they both kept guarded. "Tell me about your students," Gavin asked, genuinely interested, leaning with his elbows on the table in a way his corporate office posture would never allow. There was something liberating about letting his defenses down, about not needing to perform success and control. Stella's eyes lit up in a way that made Gavin's heart speed up. "There's a boy in my class, Marcus," she began, her hands gesturing softly as she spoke, creating small movements in the air that Gavin found hypnotizing. 15 years old, lives in a shelter with his mother and 3 younger siblings. Comes to school wearing the same hoodie every day, always with the hood up, eyes down, trying to be invisible. She paused, taking a small sip of water, and Gavin noticed how her throat moved as she swallowed a movement so simple, yet he found it unexpectedly intimate. "On the first day of class, I asked everyone to write about a moment when they felt truly alive. Most wrote about vacations, parties, things like that." Marcus turned in a blank sheet. "What did you do?" Gavin asked, completely absorbed. "I kept him after class," Stella continued, a soft smile touching her lips with the memory. "Not to scold him, but to talk. I asked if he couldn't remember such a moment or if it was too difficult to write about. And do you know what he told me?" Gavin shook his head, hanging on every word. He said, "Miss Morgan, people like me don't have moments like that. We just try to survive until the next day." Stella's voice trembled, slightly raw emotion breaking through her professional composure. He was 15 and had already given up on feeling anything beyond tiredness. Gavin felt something tighten in his chest, a mixture of sadness and anger at the injustice of children carrying weights no young shoulders should bear. "What did you say to him?" Stella looked directly at Gavin, and there was an intensity in her eyes that held him. "I told him I knew him, that I had been him, that I understood what it was like to wake up every day feeling like you were fighting the entire world just to keep existing." She took a deep breath, raw vulnerability on her face. "And then I told him about a night many years ago when someone saw me, really saw me, and how that moment, that small kindness, planted a seed of hope that I carried with me until it grew into something bigger." Gavin felt his throat tighten. He knew which night she was describing. "You told him about us. Not about you specifically," Stella said softly, "but about what that moment meant, about how a small act of humanity can change the trajectory of a life." "And did it work?" Gavin asked, his voice lower than he intended. Stella's smile widened, genuine and radiant. 3 months later, Marcus turned in a 10-page essay about the first time his 4-year-old sister read an entire word by herself. He said for the first time he could see beyond survival. He could see possibility. "That was the first time I saw him smile." Gavin felt something warm spread in his chest, not physical desire, although that was there too, pulsing low and persistent, but something deeper. Admiration, respect, a connection that went beyond superficial attraction. "You changed his life," he said. "No," Stella gently corrected, shaking her head. "I just helped him see what was already there, just like you did for me once." Her hands were on the table, almost touching his, separated by only inches that seemed charged with electricity. Gavin observed her fingers, long, delicate, but with subtle calluses that spoke of work, of effort, of a life lived with purpose. "What about you?" Stella asked, leaning slightly forward. The movement brought her scent to Gavin, something floral and sweet, but with a deeper note underneath, something that made him want to move closer. "What brings you joy when you're not in courtrooms defending corporations? What makes your heart race?" Gavin opened his mouth and then closed it again. The question should be simple, but he realized with a shock of recognition that he had no answer. When was the last time he had done something simply because he wanted to, not because he should? When had he felt genuine joy, not just satisfaction from a case won or a bonus received? "I don't know," he finally admitted, and there was raw pain in that confession. "I used to enjoy photography when I was younger, had an old camera I bought at a thrift store, spent hours wandering around the city, capturing moments, but—" He paused, searching for words. I stopped. There wasn't a specific moment. Life got too busy, and it seemed frivolous without purpose. "Without purpose?" Stella repeated, and there was something that seemed very much like sadness in her voice. "Gavin, creating art, capturing beauty, seeing the world differently, that's not without purpose. That's what makes us human." She reached out her hand, and this time it wasn't a hesitant or comforting touch. She took his hand firmly, intertwining her fingers with his in a way that felt both natural and revolutionary. Gavin looked at their joined hands and felt something inside him break, not in a painful way, but like a cocoon opening. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Stella asked softly, her eyes searching his. Gavin shook his head, unable to form words. "I see someone who's hungry," she said. And there was no judgment in her voice, only understanding. Not for food or success or material things, but for meaning, for connection, for something real in a world of superficialities. The words hit him like arrows, each finding its target with surgical precision. How could she see him so clearly when he could barely see himself? "I've spent so much time building this life," Gavin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The right apartment, the right car, the right position. I thought when I got there, when I had everything I'd planned for, I would finally feel complete. But the more I achieve, the emptier it seems." "Because you're measuring the wrong life with the wrong metrics," Stella replied, gently squeezing his hand. "Success isn't about how much you accumulate. It's about how much you live, how much you feel, how much you connect." Gavin turned her hand over, exposing her palm, and gently traced the lines there with his index finger. It was an intimate gesture, almost unconscious, but Stella didn't pull away. Instead, he felt a slight tremor pass through her, saw her lips part slightly as her breathing became a little faster. "You scare me," he admitted, eyes still fixed on her hand, unable to face the intensity of her gaze. "Because you make me want things I thought I'd given up on. Make me question everything." "Good," Stella said, and there was a note of challenge in her voice that made Gavin finally look up to meet her eyes. "Maybe it's time to question. Maybe it's time to stop living on autopilot and really choose how you want to live." The conversation around them had quieted down. Gavin vaguely noticed that the cafe was emptier now, that the lights had been slightly dimmed, creating a more intimate atmosphere. Or perhaps the world had always been this way, and he had simply never paid attention. "If you could do anything," Stella asked, her voice soft but insistent, "without worrying about money or expectations or what anyone else would think, what would you do?" Gavin thought, really thought. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine something beyond the next case, the next promotion, the next arbitrary milestone of success. I think I would like to help people who really need it. Not corporations fighting for a few more millions, but real people, families facing unfair evictions, workers being exploited, immigrants navigating impossible systems." Stella smiled, and it was the kind of smile that lit up her entire face, making those small wrinkles appear at the corners of her eyes. "Then why don't you?" "Because it's scary," Gavin admitted. "Because it would mean leaving everything I've built. Because I don't know if I'm brave enough." "Gavin," Stella said, and there was so much conviction in her voice that he had no choice but to believe. "You're one of the bravest men I know. You've just forgotten that." He squeezed her hand, allowing himself to absorb her strength, her certainty, and looking into those deep brown eyes, seeing himself reflected in them, not as the successful but empty lawyer he had become, but as the man he could be. Gavin felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Time had a strange way of behaving when Gavin was with Stella. Sometimes it seemed to drag like honey, each second stretching into a delicious eternity, and other times it shot by like an arrow, hours evaporating into minutes. When he looked at the clock, he was shocked to realize it was past 10 at night. They had been there for more than 4 hours, and it felt simultaneously like an eternity in the blink of an eye. The waitress had passed by their table 3 times, each time with a more understanding smile, until she finally approached with the delicacy of someone who didn't want to interrupt something precious. "Sorry, folks," she said softly, "but we're closing in 15 minutes." Gavin felt a tightness in his chest, a physical resistance to the idea of leaving this place, this moment, this connection. He looked at Stella and saw the same reluctance reflected in her eyes, a gentle sadness, but also something more, an unformulated question hanging in the air between them. "Of course," Stella said to the waitress, smiling politely. "Could you bring the check, please?" But when the waitress walked away, Stella made no movement to get up. Instead, her fingers nervously played with the paper napkin on the table, folding and unfolding the corners, creating small creases that she repeatedly smoothed out. Gavin recognized the gesture. She was processing something, gathering courage to say something. He paid the bill quickly, leaving a generous tip for the waitress's patience, and then they stepped out onto the sidewalk. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of jasmine flowers from some nearby garden and the distant smell of rain that hadn't yet arrived. The street was quiet, only a few cars passing occasionally, their lights creating ephemeral patterns on the damp asphalt. Stella hugged herself, an unconscious gesture against the slight cold, and Gavin, without thinking, took off his jacket and placed it over her shoulders. The fabric was too large, swallowing her slightly. But there was something deeply satisfying about seeing her wearing something of his, as if it were a mark, a subtle claim. "Thank you," she said softly, pulling the jacket tighter around herself. The gesture brought his scent to her, something woody and expensive. But beneath that, something that was purely Gavin, a smell she already knew she wouldn't forget. They stood there for a moment, a few steps from the cafe door, neither wanting to take the first step toward goodbye. The moon was high in the sky, almost full, bathing everything in a soft silver light that made Stella's skin appear luminescent. "I almost didn't come today," Gavin suddenly admitted, the words coming out before he could censor them. There was a raw vulnerability in his voice that surprised him. "I almost canceled 3 times. Made up excuses in my head, too much work, too tired. Blind dates never work out." Stella looked at him, eyes shining under the moonlight. "Why did you come then?" Gavin chuckled softly, a sound without humor. "Because Sophie threatened to show up at my office and physically drag me if I canceled again. And because—" He paused, searching for honesty. "Because part of me was tired of saying no to everything. I almost gave up too," Stella confessed, turning to face him completely. They were close now, just inches apart. Close enough that Gavin could see the small freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose, almost invisible under the dim light. "Actually, I was in my car key in the ignition, ready to drive away. I sat there for 10 minutes trying to convince myself to go in." "What changed your mind?" Gavin asked, and his voice came out lower, more intimate than he intended. Stella bit her lower lip, a nervous habit that Gavin was beginning to recognize, and that made him want to reach out and touch that lip with his thumb, free it from her teeth. "I thought about you," she said simply. "About that boy on the steps. About that moment of kindness that I carried with me for so long. And I thought, what if he's still there somewhere, under all that successful adult armor? What if this is my chance to finally thank you, to discover who you've become?" Gavin felt something shift in his chest, an emotion so intense it almost hurt. "And?" he asked, barely able to breathe. "Who did you discover?" Stella took a step closer, almost completely eliminating the distance between them. Gavin could feel the heat emanating from her body, could see the way her chest rose and fell with each breath slightly accelerated. "I discovered," she said softly, her eyes searching his with an intensity that held him in place, that boy didn't go away. He was just waiting for someone worth coming out of the shadows for. The statement hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning, with possibility, with breathtaking vulnerability. Gavin raised his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But she didn't move. His fingers found her face, his palm gently curved against her cheek, his thumb lightly tracing the arc of her cheekbone. Her skin was soft, warm, and he could feel a slight tremor pass through her under his touch. Stella's eyes closed for a moment, just a second, as if she was savoring the sensation, memorizing it. When they opened again, there was something different in them, a depth and openness that invited him in. "Can I see you again?" Gavin asked, and there was an urgency in his voice that surprised him. It wasn't simply desire, though, that was there, pulsing low and insistent in his veins, but a deeper need, a need to not let this connection slip away, to not go back to his empty, lonely life, as if this night had never happened. The smile that lit up Stella's face was like the sun rising. "Yes," she said simply, but then added with a mischievous gleam in her eyes, "but no fancy, elegant places. There's a diner near my school that serves the best apple pie in the city, open 24 hours, 80s music on the jukebox, and coffee that's strong enough to resurrect the dead." Gavin laughed, a genuine, spontaneous laugh, the kind that came from deep in his belly and made him feel lighter. "A diner," he repeated, as if testing the word. "I can't even remember the last time I was in one." "Then it's time," Stella said. and there was something challenging in her smile, as if she was saying, "Let's see if you can step out of your comfort zone." Gavin slid his hand from her face to the nape of her neck, his fingers lightly entangling in her hair. It was a possessive, intimate gesture, and he felt Stella inhale sharply, her lips parting slightly. They were so close now that their breaths mingled warm and quick. "I think the cafe Gavin needs to meet the diner Gavin," he said softly, echoing her words in a different way, loading them with promise. "I think so," Stella agreed, her voice barely more than a whisper. She raised her hand and placed it on his chest above his heart, and Gavin knew she could feel how it was racing, beating wildly against his ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. They stayed like that for a long moment, suspended on the threshold of something new and frightening and incredibly promising. The street around them had disappeared, the world shrinking to contain only the two of them, only this moment, only the vibrant possibility hanging in the air between them. "When?" Gavin asked, and didn't care that he seemed eager, desperate even. He was beyond pretending indifference, beyond playing the power games he mastered so well in his professional life. "Tomorrow," Stella suggested, and there was hope in her voice mixed with nervousness. "Saturday night, 8 o'clock. "Tomorrow seems too far away," Gavin murmured, and it was true. The idea of spending the next 22 hours without seeing her, without hearing her voice, without being in this presence that made him feel more alive than he had felt in years, seemed unbearable. Stella laughed softly, the sound vibrating between them. "It'll go by quickly," she promised. "Besides, anticipation is part of the fun." Gavin knew she was right, but still he was reluctant to let her go. Finally, with an effort that cost more than it should have, he stepped back, letting his hand slide from her neck, his fingers trailing across her skin in a final touch. "I'll meet you there tomorrow then. Send me the address." Stella nodded, already reaching for her phone. They exchanged numbers, fingers briefly touching during the transfer, each contact sending small shockwaves up Gavin's arm. When they finally parted for real, both walking in opposite directions on the sidewalk, Gavin turned 3 times to look back. All 3 times, Stella was looking back too. The diner was exactly as Stella had promised, a nostalgic piece of 1,950 seconds, America, that had miraculously survived the city's changes. Red vinyl booths patched with silver duct tape, a white Formica counter stained with coffee, and a jukebox in the corner playing Elvis Presley on an endless loop. The smell was an intoxicating blend of fried bacon, strong coffee, and freshly baked apple pie so thick it was almost tangible. Gavin arrived 10 minutes early, wearing jeans, something he hadn't worn in so long he'd forgotten how comfortable they were, and a light blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He felt strangely exposed without his suit, but also lighter, more himself. When Stella walked in, something inside him both calmed and accelerated at once. She wore a yellow summer dress with small white flowers, her hair loose, falling in waves over her shoulders. And when her eyes found his across the busy diner, she smiled that smile that made small wrinkles appear at the corners of her eyes, and that Gavin was already beginning to find addictive. She slid into the booth across from him, and immediately the space between them seemed charged with electricity, as if the air had become denser, more aware of their presence. "You came," she said, and there was a note of relief in her voice that touched him. "Of course I came," Gavin replied, reaching his hand across the table. She took it without hesitation, intertwining her fingers with his in a way that was already beginning to feel natural, necessary even. "I couldn't think about anything else all day." It was true. He had tried to work, had opened files and reviewed contracts, but his mind kept wandering to the way she bit her lip when she was thinking, to the sound of her laughter, to how she made him want to be a better version of himself. The waitress, an older woman with cherry red dyed hair and a name tag that read Donna, appeared with notepad in hand. "The usual, honey?" she asked Stella with the familiarity of someone who knew her well. "Please, Donna," Stella replied, smiling. "And bring an extra slice for Gavin here. He needs to try your pie." "Coming right up," Donna said, winking at Stella in a way that suggested tacit approval before walking away. "Do you come here often?" Gavin asked, liking the idea of learning more about her life, the places she frequented, the routines that defined her days. "Every Friday night after work," Stella admitted. "It's my ritual." A whole week dealing with hormonal teenagers, frustrated parents, and suffocating educational bureaucracy. I come here, eat apple pie, drink coffee that's too terrible, and remind myself why I chose this life. And why did you choose it? Gavin asked, genuinely curious. Stella thought for a moment, her fingers still intertwined with his on the table. Because someone once saw me when I was invisible, she said softly, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that held him. And that moment changed the trajectory of my entire life. I want to be that person for others. I want to be the teacher who sees the quiet girl in the back of the room, who notices the boy who always stays behind. I want to plant seeds of hope even if I never see the fully grown tree. Gavin squeezed her hand, emotion tightening his throat. How was it possible that someone could be so genuinely good, so consistently selfless? And how was it possible that he had spent years building a life that helped the rich get richer while people like Stella struggled to make a real difference with minimal resources? The pie arrived 2 generous slices, with vanilla ice cream melting down the sides, creating small, creamy puddles on the plate. Gavin picked up his fork and cut a piece, bringing it to his mouth. The flavor exploded on his palate, sweet apples with cinnamon, buttery crust that melted away, a touch of nutmeg that made everything perfect. My God, he murmured, his eyes widening. This is amazing. Stella laughed, that musical sound that made something warm in his chest. I told you it was the best in the city. Donna has been making this pie with the same recipe for 30 years. It's like comfort memory in dessert form. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, occasionally exchanging glances and smiles, but it was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. There was no need to fill every second with words when just being together was enough. When Stella reached for another piece of pie, a bit of melted ice cream clung to the corner of her lips. Without thinking, Gavin reached out and gently wiped it away with his thumb, the touch lasting a second longer than necessary. Stella froze, her eyes widening slightly, her lips parting in small surprise. Sorry, he murmured, but it didn't sound like an apology. It sounded like a promise. Don't apologize, she replied, echoing the words she had said the night before, her voice coming out hoarser than normal. The moment stretched tense and charged until Donna appeared again to refill the coffee, breaking the spell. But something had changed. A line had been crossed, a tacit acknowledgement that what was happening between them went beyond simply meeting someone new. The dates became frequent after that. 2 nights later, Gavin took her to a photography exhibition at a small gallery downtown, something he would never have done before meeting her, but now seemed important, a way to share a part of himself he had buried long ago. Stella walked slowly from photo to photo, studying each image with genuine attention, and when she turned to him with shining eyes and said, "You should start doing this again. You have an eye for beauty that most people have lost," Gavin felt something inside him break and rebuild at the same time. The following week, she took him to see her school. It was Saturday, the building empty and quiet, but Stella guided him through the hallways with the kind of pride that only comes from truly loving what you do. She showed him her classroom walls covered with quotes from famous authors and student work, a bookshelf overflowing with well-worn books, her desk cluttered with papers and colored pens. "This is my kingdom," she said with a self-deprecating smile. "It's not much, but it's mine." Gavin looked around, absorbing every detail, and thought he had never been in a place that seemed richer in purpose and meaning than that simple classroom. "It's perfect," he said sincerely, and when she turned to look at him, there were tears shining in her eyes. Each date brought them closer. The touches became more frequent, more daring, a hand on the small of her back while guiding her through a door, fingers intertwined during long walks in the park, his arm around her shoulders on a particularly cold night while waiting for her taxi. And then came the night of dinner at her apartment. Stella had insisted on cooking for him, refusing his offers to take her to sophisticated restaurants. "I want you to see how I really live," she had said. No filters, no performance. Her apartment was small, a studio on the 3rd floor of an old building without an elevator, but it was full of life. Books stacked on every available surface, green plants in the windows, colorful cushions on the worn couch, photos of students and friends on the walls. It smelled of spices and something sweet baking in the oven. "Welcome to my world," Stella said, a little nervous as she closed the door behind him. Gavin gently pulled her to him, his hands resting on her waist. "Your world is beautiful," he said. And he wasn't just talking about the apartment. He was talking about everything, the way she lived, the choices she made, the person she was. They dined by candlelight at the small kitchen table, knees touching underneath, conversations flowing as easily as they always did. But there was something different about that night, an underlying tension, an awareness of each other's bodies that made each accidental touch a charged moment. When they finished eating, Stella got up to wash the dishes, but Gavin gently held her by the wrist. "Leave that," he said, his voice low. "Come here." She did, allowing him to pull her to the couch. They sat side by side so close that there was no space between them, and Gavin put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her even closer. Stella nestled against him, her head resting on his shoulder. And for a long moment, they just existed like that, breathing in sync. "Gavin," Stella said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Yes, I'm falling for you." The confession was simple, disarming in its honesty. Gavin turned slightly, catching her chin between his fingers and lifting her face to look her in the eyes. "I've already fallen," he replied. And then finally he did what he had wanted to do since that first night at the cafe. He kissed her. The kiss began softly, almost hesitantly, lips meeting with the delicacy of a question being asked. But when Stella sighed against his mouth, when her fingers entwined in the hair at the nape of Gavin's neck, something inside him crumbled. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, more necessary, as if they were trying to communicate years of loneliness and yearning in a single moment. Gavin's hand slid around Stella's waist, pulling her closer, eliminating any space that still existed between them. She responded by climbing onto his lap, her legs folding on either side of his thighs, and her weight, her closeness, her warmth, all of it made Gavin's head spin in a way no amount of expensive whiskey ever could. When they finally separated to breathe, both breathless, foreheads resting against each other, eyes still closed as if trying to memorize every sensation, Gavin murmured, his voice thick with desire and something deeper, more frightening. "Stella, are you sure? Because if we start this, I don't know if I'll be able to stop. I don't know if I'll want to stop." Stella opened her eyes, and what he saw there hit him like lightning. Desire, yes, but also trust, choice, a vulnerable openness that touched him more deeply than any physical touch could. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said, and there was a firmness in her voice that left no room for doubt. Gavin stood up, holding her easily, her hands around his neck, her legs wrapped around his waist. She was light, fitting perfectly against him. He walked the few steps to her bed, a double bed covered with a floral comforter and soft pillows that smelled of lavender and Stella, and laid her down gently, as if she were something precious, something sacred. And to him, in that moment, she was. It wasn't just physical desire, though, that pulsed intense and urgent in his veins, but the desire to know her completely, to be known by her, to create an intimacy that went beyond the body. Gavin knelt beside the bed, his eyes roaming her face with an intensity that made Stella's heart race. "You're so beautiful," he murmured. And it wasn't just a line, wasn't empty seduction. It was truth, distilled into words. Stella reached out, touching his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw, the lower lip she had already memorized through kisses. "Then show me," she whispered. "Show me how you see me." And he did. Gavin's fingers found the buttons of her blouse, unbuttoning each one with a deliberate slowness that bordered on torture. Stella could feel his breath against her exposed skin, hot and irregular, and each newly revealed inch seemed to make time slow down. When her blouse was finally removed, when she lay there in just her simple cotton underwear and bra, no expensive lace or seductive lingerie, just her in her most honest form, she felt a vulnerability that went beyond the physical. But the way Gavin looked at her, as if he was seeing art in a museum, as if she were the most precious thing he had ever witnessed, made all insecurity melt away. "Perfect," he whispered. And then his mouth was on her neck, kissing lightly, nibbling, making its way along her collarbone into the valley between her breasts. Stella arched against him, hands pulling at his shirt, desperate to feel skin against skin. Gavin moved back just enough to pull the shirt over his head, and then they were skin to skin, heat to heat, and the contact was so intense that they both sighed simultaneously. His hands were everywhere, tracing the curve of her waist, sliding along the side of her ribs, exploring every line and angle as if memorizing a map. And Stella explored him back, fingers running over his broad chest, feeling the muscles contract under her touch, his breathing becoming faster, more shallow. "Gavin." She moaned when his mouth found her breast, when his tongue traced circles that made stars explode behind her closed eyelids. Her hands buried themselves in his hair, holding him there, not wanting that sensation to end. He continued his exploration, kissing a path down her stomach, hands sliding over the curve of her hips, the tops of her thighs. Each touch was adoration, each kiss a promise. And when he finally removed the last barrier between them, when he saw her completely naked and vulnerable beneath him, Gavin had to stop and just breathe, just absorb the magnitude of the moment. "You too," Stella said, her voice husky. "I want to see you, all of you." Gavin stood up, his eyes never leaving hers as he removed what remained of his clothes. And then they were completely naked, completely exposed. And there was something deeply intimate about just looking at each other like this, about allowing themselves to be seen without filters, without defenses. Stella opened her arms, inviting him back, and Gavin went covering her body with his weight both comforting and exciting at the same time. He supported himself on his elbows, not wanting to crush her, and looked into her eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked again, because he needed to hear it, needed to know that she wanted this as much as he did. "Yes," Stella answered without hesitation, without doubt. She wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him closer. "Yes, Gavin. Please." The moment they joined was simultaneously intense and gentle, urgent and tender. Gavin moved slowly at first, giving their bodies time to adjust, to find their rhythm. Stella moved with him, against him, creating a dance that was theirs alone, a language spoken through touch and sigh and soft moan. His hands were intertwined with hers, fingers tightly gripping, braced above her head against the pillows. Their faces were close, breaths mingling, eyes open and fixed on each other because they both needed to see, needed to witness, needed to be completely present in that moment. "Are you with me?" Gavin whispered, his voice tense with restraint, with the almost painful desire to let go, but also with the need to take her with him, to ensure she felt everything he was feeling. "I'm with you," Stella answered, and then louder, more urgent. "I'm with you, Gavin. Don't stop." The rhythm increased, became more frantic, more desperate. Sweat glistened on their skin, muscles trembled with effort and pleasure, and the tension built and built until it was almost unbearable. Stella's nails lightly scratched his back, marking him, claiming him, and that was enough to push him beyond the edge. "Stella," he groaned against her neck, and the sound of her name on his lips, laden with pleasure and adoration, was what took her along with him. They shattered together, bodies tense and trembling, waves of pleasure washing over them so intensely that for a moment there was no thought, no past or future, just that eternal present of pure sensation and absolute connection. Afterward, when their breathing finally began to normalize, when the tremors subsided to occasional shivers, Gavin carefully moved to the side, not wanting to crush her with his weight. He pulled her into his arms, and Stella went easily, fitting perfectly against his chest, her head resting over his still racing heart. He pulled the comforter over them, creating a cocoon of warmth and safety. His hand traced lazy patterns on her back, circles, lines, abstract shapes that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Stella's hair was spread across his chest, and he buried his nose in it, inhaling the scent of flowery shampoo and sweat and something that was intrinsically her. "I feel like someone finally sees me," Stella murmured in the dark, her voice sleepy but happy. Gavin kissed the top of her head, his lips lingering there for a long moment. "I will never stop seeing you," he promised. And they weren't just empty words after sex. It was a vow, a commitment, a declaration of intent. Stella raised her head slightly, looking at him in the dimness of the room. There were tears shining in the corners of her eyes, but she was smiling. "I love you," she said simply and directly, without games or strategy. "I know it's too soon to say this. I know I should wait, but I can't hold it in. I love you, Gavin Reynolds." Gavin's heart stopped, and then started again, beating so hard that he was sure she could hear it. No one had ever said those words to him like that, with such certainty, with such raw and honest vulnerability. And for the first time in his life, he said them back and truly meant it. "I love you too," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you, Stella Morgan. And I think I've been loving you since that night on the steps. I just didn't know it yet." She kissed him then, soft, sweet, A kiss that didn't lead to more, but that was perfect in its simplicity. And when she nestled back against him, when their breathing began to slow toward sleep, they both knew that something had fundamentally changed. They were no longer two separate people navigating the world alone. They were an us, a together, a team, and that changed everything. The months that followed were like waking from a deep sleep. Gavin began to notice things that had previously passed invisibly by him, the way morning light entered through the window of his apartment, creating golden patterns on the floor, the laughter of children playing in the park during his morning run, the smell of fresh coffee being brewed in small neighborhood cafes he had never noticed before. It was as if the world had gained color, texture, depth. But the deepest change was happening inside him. It was on a Thursday afternoon, sitting at his mahogany desk in the panoramic office on the 23rd floor, reviewing a merger contract worth $16 million, when something inside him simply broke. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that something finally fell into place. He looked at the dense pages of legal jargon, at the numbers representing fortunes being moved from one account to another, at the clauses designed to protect the rich and powerful, and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sense of purpose, just an emptiness that expanded like a crater in his chest. His mind wandered to Stella, as it often did lately, and he imagined her at that exact moment, probably in her classroom, leaning over the desk of some student struggling with grammar or text interpretation, her eyes shining with that passion that made his heart race. She was making a real difference, touching lives, planting seeds of hope in fertile soil. And him? He was helping corporations swallow other corporations, helping the rich get richer while the rest of the world struggled to survive. The nausea he felt was physical, visceral. Gavin closed the contract folder, stood up, and walked to the window. The city stretched below him, millions of people living their lives, fighting their battles, carrying their burdens. And suddenly, he no longer wanted to be above them, looking down from his ivory tower. He wanted to be down there in the midst of real life, doing something that mattered. The decision, when it finally crystallized, was both terrifying and liberating. That night, he went straight to Stella's apartment. She opened the door, still wearing her work slacks and blouse, red mark test papers in one hand, her hair tied in a messy bun, and the sight of her, so real, so present, so alive, made something inside him expand, until it seemed his chest couldn't contain it. "Gavin," she said, surprised but happy. "I thought you had that dinner with clients tonight." "I canceled," he said simply, stepping in and closing the door behind him. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the familiar scent of flower shampoo and coffee and chalk. "I needed to see you." Stella moved back slightly, studying his face with those observant eyes that never missed anything. "What happened?" Gavin led her to the couch, sitting down and pulling her to sit beside him. Their hands intertwined between them. "I'm leaving the firm," he said, and the words that should have sounded frightening came out laden with relief. Stella's eyes widened. "What? Gavin, are you sure? That's a huge decision." "I've never been more certain of anything," he replied, echoing the words she had said to him that first night together. "Stella, I've spent the last 10 years building a career that looks impressive on paper but is killing me inside. I wake up every morning with a weight on my chest. I go to bed every night feeling like I've wasted another day doing things that don't matter." He squeezed her hands, trying to make her understand. "You changed something in me. You showed me there's another way to live, another way to measure success, and I can't keep pretending it's all okay, that money and prestige are enough when I know they're not." Tears shone in Stella's eyes, but she was smiling. "What are you going to do?" Gavin took a deep breath, and for the first time in years felt genuine excitement running through his veins. "I'm going to open my own practice. Legal services for low-income families. Pro bono cases helping people who really need it but don't have the resources to pay expensive lawyers. It will mean less money, long hours, difficult cases that I might lose more than win." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "But it will mean waking up every morning knowing I'm doing something that matters." Stella kissed him, then deep, passionate, a kiss that said more than words ever could. When they separated, she was really crying now, tears flowing freely down her face. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "So incredibly proud." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Gavin handed in his resignation letter, facing disbelief and even hostility from some of the older partners who saw his decision as betrayal. He sold his expensive apartment and moved to a smaller, more modest place, saving the difference to invest in his new practice. Stella was by his side every step of the way. She helped him find a small office in a working-class neighborhood, paint the walls a welcoming shade of light blue, assemble second-hand furniture they bought at thrift stores. They worked side by side late into the night, laughing when something went wrong, celebrating each small achievement with cheap pizza and tight hugs. On the day of the official opening, Gavin was nervous in a way he had never been in corporate courtrooms. There was only a small ad in the community newspaper, a simple sign in the window, but that was all he needed. This was real. This mattered. His first client was a woman named Rosa, 52 years old, working 3 jobs to support 4 grandchildren after her daughter had died of an overdose. She was facing unfair eviction, the landlord wanting to remove her to sell the building to developers. Rosa entered the office with shoulders bent by the weight of the world, tired eyes that had seen too much pain, too much injustice. And when Gavin said he would help her, that he would fight for her without charging anything, because that's what decent people do for each other, she cried. "Why are you doing this?" she asked through her tears. "You don't even know me." Gavin thought of Stella, how she dedicated her life to helping children society had forgotten. He thought of that night on the steps many years ago, how a small act of kindness had planted a seed that kept growing. "Because everyone deserves to be seen," he said simply. "Everyone deserves to have someone on their side." The case took 3 months. Gavin worked tirelessly researching precedents, building arguments, using every skill he had honed in corporate courtrooms, but now applying them on behalf of someone who really needed it. And when the judge finally ruled in Rosa's favor, when she hugged him so tightly he could barely breathe, as she sobbed with relief against his shoulder, Gavin felt something he had never felt in any of his multi-million-dollar corporate victories. He felt like he had made a real difference, that his life had purpose, that he mattered in a way that transcended bank accounts and impressive titles. That night, he took Stella to dinner at the diner, their place now, loaded with memories and meaning. They sat in the same booth where they had sat on their first date, and Gavin took her hands across the table. "You saved me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Saved me from a life that looked good on the surface but was empty inside. You showed me there's another way, a better way." Stella shook her head, squeezing his hands. "No, Gavin. I just helped you remember who you always were. That boy on the steps who cared, who saw people. He never went away. He was just waiting for the right moment to come back." They looked at each other across the table, across all the months they had shared, across all the changes and growth and transformation. And Gavin knew with a certainty that went down to his bones that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with this extraordinary woman. He wanted to wake up beside her every morning. He wanted to face challenges with her, celebrate victories with her, build a life that mattered with her by his side. He wanted everything. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to admit it. A year had passed since that first night at the Rosewood Cafe, 365 days that had completely transformed Gavin's life in ways he never could have imagined. He was no longer the empty corporate lawyer who entered blind dates without hope. He was a man who woke up every morning with purpose, who saw the world in vibrant colors instead of shades of gray, who loved deeply and was deeply loved in return. It was Friday night, Stella's sacred pie night at the diner. But this time Gavin had arrived earlier, much earlier. He was sitting on the red vinyl bench, his hands trembling slightly as he rotated the small velvet box in his pocket, checking for the 10th time that it was still there, that it was real, that he really was about to do this. Donna, the cherry red-haired waitress, who had witnessed the evolution of their relationship over the months, slid into the booth across from him with a knowing smile. "So today's the big day, huh, honey?" Gavin nodded, unable to trust his voice. He had faced intimidating judges, aggressive lawyers, high-pressure situations that would have made most people crumble. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had made him as nervous as this moment. "She's going to say, yes, you know," Donna said gently, placing a wrinkled hand over his. "That girl loves you in a way you rarely see. It's the kind of love that makes this old, cynical heart believe in happy endings again." Gavin smiled, squeezing her hand with gratitude. "I just want to do this right. She deserves something perfect." "Honey," Donna said with wisdom acquired over decades of serving coffee and listening to life stories, "perfect isn't about expensive places or grand gestures. Perfect is about truth. And you bringing her back to where it all began, that's as true as it gets. 15 minutes later, Stella walked in. She was wearing jeans and a simple blue blouse, her hair loose, falling in waves over her shoulders, a stack of graded tests under one arm, and that smile that still made Gavin's heart skip a beat every time he saw her. "Sorry I'm late," she said, sliding into the booth across from him and leaning in for a quick kiss that somehow managed to be both casual and completely devastating. Parent-teacher conference ran long. Marcus's mom wanted to thank me personally. He got accepted to university with a full scholarship. Her eyes were shining with pride, and Gavin felt that familiar wave of admiration and love wash over him. She cared so much, invested so much of herself in her students, and each of their victories was her victory too. "That's amazing, love," he said sincerely, taking her hand across the table as they always did. "You changed that boy's life." "We changed it," Stella corrected, squeezing his fingers. "You spent hours helping him with the application process. Remember? Reviewing his essays, advising him on financial aid." It was true. Over the past months, their lives had become so completely intertwined that it was hard to say where one ended and the other began. Stella's students often appeared at Gavin's office, seeking legal advice for their families. Gavin's clients often had children whom Stella knew or had taught. They had become a team facing life side by side. Donna brought the usual slices of apple pie without them having to order, winking at Gavin in a way that made Stella look between them with playful suspicion. "What's going on?" she asked, biting her lip in a way that still made Gavin want to pull her into his arms. "You two are acting strange." Gavin took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Stella," he began, and his voice trembled slightly, betraying his nervousness. "Do you remember the first time we came here on that second date?" She nodded, a soft smile touching her lips with the memory. "Of course I remember. You looked so out of place at first, all serious and proper. But then you tasted the pie and your whole face lit up like a child's. You told me that night that the cafe Gavin needed to meet the diner Gavin," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "And you were right. Because it was here, in this simple and honest place, that I began to remember who I really was, or perhaps who I wanted to be." Stella squeezed his hand, sensing that something important was happening, that this wasn't just another Friday dinner. Gavin slid out of the booth, and before Stella could process what was happening, he was kneeling beside the table, a small velvet box open in his hands. The diamond inside wasn't huge. He no longer needed to prove anything with excessive gestures, but it was perfect, delicate and timeless, just like her. The entire diner fell silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks were lowered. Even the music from the jukebox seemed to decrease in volume. "Stella Morgan," Gavin said, and his voice was steady, now laden with certainty and love, and everything he had held inside him, waiting for this moment. "A year ago, I walked into a cafe with no expectations, no hope, just going through the motions of a life that seemed empty. And then you looked me in the eyes and asked if I remembered you." Tears were already forming in Stella's eyes, one hand covering her mouth in shock and joy. "The truth is," Gavin continued, a smile trembling on his lips, "part of me always remembered, always carried that night on the steps. That moment of human connection when everything else seemed superficial, and when you walked into that cafe when our eyes met, it was as if my soul recognized yours, as if I had been waiting for you all along." He took a deep breath, raw vulnerability in every word. "You taught me that success without love is nothing, that prestige without purpose is empty, that real life doesn't happen in luxury offices and expensive restaurants, but in moments like this. Simple, honest, true." His voice broke slightly, emotion overflowing. "You taught me to see again, to feel again, to live again, and I want to spend the rest of my life seeing you, loving you, building something real and meaningful by your side." He held the box higher, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "So, Stella Morgan, extraordinary teacher, strongest woman I know, love of my life, will you marry me?" For a moment that seemed to stretch for all eternity, Stella couldn't speak. Tears were flowing freely down her face, and she was laughing and crying at the same time, one hand still covering her mouth, while the other gripped his shoulder as if she needed to anchor herself to something real. "Yes," she finally managed to say the word, coming out as a joyful sob. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. The diner erupted in applause. Donna was openly crying, as was half the clientele. Gavin slid the ring onto Stella's finger with slightly trembling hands, and then she was pulling him up, throwing her arms around his neck and kissing him with all the passion and joy and love they had built over that extraordinary year. When they finally separated, both crying and laughing, foreheads touching, breaths mingling, completely lost in each other while the diner continued applauding around them, Stella whispered against his lips, "And you taught me that being seen is more powerful than being admired. That a kind heart is worth more than all the gold in the world. That the boy on the steps who cared that boy became the most amazing man I know." They were married 3 months later in a small community garden that Stella's students had helped plant as a spring project. There were no excessive expenses or endless guest lists, just the people who really mattered. Close friends, family, and dozens of Stella's students, many holding books she had given them instead of traditional bouquets. Sophie, Gavin's sister, who had insisted on that blind date a year ago, was the maid of honor, smiling with tears in her eyes throughout the ceremony. "I knew," she whispered to Gavin before he walked down the makeshift aisle. "From the beginning, I knew she was special." When Gavin saw Stella walking toward him through the flowering garden, wearing a simple white lace dress that made her look ethereal and yet completely down to earth, he felt his heart expand so much that it seemed impossible to be contained in his chest. The vows were simple but devastatingly honest. Gavin promised to always see her, always choose her, always fight alongside her for things that mattered. Stella promised to be his light when darkness threatened, his strength when he faltered, his home wherever life took them. And when the officiant finally said, "You may kiss the bride," Gavin pulled Stella into his arms and kissed her with all the gratitude and love and joy that a human soul could contain. The party was at the same diner, Donna refusing to accept payment and instead serving apple pie to all the guests. Marcus, the student Stella had helped, gave a speech that left not a dry eye in the place, talking about how Ms. Morgan had saved his life by refusing to let him be invisible. "And then," Marcus said, looking at the newlywed couple with reverence, "she found Mr. Reynolds, who also believes in seeing people, and now they're changing the world together, one life at a time." Late that night, when the guests had departed and they were finally alone in the small apartment they now called home, Gavin held Stella in his arms and looked into her eyes. Those deep brown eyes that had seen him when he was lost, that had loved him when he was broken, that had guided him back home. "Thank you," he whispered, kissing her forehead softly. "For what?" Stella asked, confused. "For not giving up on that boy on the steps," Gavin replied, his voice rough with emotion. "For seeing something in him that was worth keeping even when no one else did." Stella smiled that smile that still made time stop. "He was always worth it," she said simply. "He just needed someone to remind him of that." And there in each other's arms, in the small apartment full of books and plants and love, they fell asleep. Not as two separate people who had found each other, but as two halves of a whole that had finally become complete. And every time they told their story in the years that followed to friends, to students, to clients, to anyone who asked how they had met, they always ended the same way. It wasn't a blind date. It was a second chance. A story of two hearts that were waiting for the right moment to truly see each other. And when they finally did, well, the rest was history. Sometimes the most beautiful stories don't begin with love at first sight. They begin with recognition, with someone finally being seen after years of invisibility. Gavin and Stella proved that it's never too late for a second chance, that true success isn't measured in money or prestige, but in the ability to truly love and be loved. They discovered that being seen is more powerful than being admired, and that a single moment of kindness can echo through the years, transforming not just one life, but two. In the end, the question isn't whether you'll be remembered, but whether you'll have the courage to remember, to truly see the people around you before it's too late. And you, who have you failed to see today?